Hi, everyone. Welcome back. I'm Sonika Garcia,
And I'm Brad Davidson, and this is Breaking the Code,
a podcast series focused on debunking the myths about the discipline of behavioral science and arming our listeners with the information they need to make sense of behavioral science and how to help them apply it to their work as marketers. Welcome back. Thanks for joining. Today's episode, we are going to be talking all about community. And the term community is used a lot, in general, but specifically in the work that we do within healthcare communications. And it's important to understand one, what do we mean by community? And then, how does being part of a community or not being part of a community actually impact human behavior? And what about aspects of community is important for us to know in our jobs to do a better job at connecting with people and specifically with their health decisions? Just quick background in just doing some research into different types of community. I think the way that I understood it is, a community is any group of people that are connected by some sort of commonality. So it can be community of interest, so, similar interests, communities of action where, a group of people are trying to bring about some change or have some common goal to some extent. Then we have place, and that really is like geographic area. So maybe the only thing that connects this group of people is that you all live in the same town or the same region of the country or whatever it may be. And then we have, practice. So things like, okay, you're part of the same profession. I think about, when I think about communities of practice, I think about like KOLs a lot and HCPs and just, being part of that group. But really, the one thing that connects you is your profession. And then I found another one that was interesting, and maybe we can unpack this a bit, but like community of circumstance. So basically, I think this is like a catch-all bucket where it's, people that are brought together by some sort of situation, some sort of external event. And the way that I look at that is it's probably temporary. I mean, maybe it's something that happened that now places you in like more of a permanent group, but I think it also can be temporary where you're currently in a certain situation and that's why you're part of a certain community, but you might not be in the future. I mean, regardless of all of that, we do know that community influences behavior. Brad, can you talk to us a little bit about how do we currently leverage the idea of community in our roles? And yeah, how have you seen it being done? And what should we take away from how we can maybe improve on it?
great introduction, like very sort of broad topic, right? This idea of
Mm-hmm.
community, we think of it as like, oh, we'll build a community, we'll build a website, and then this community will exist, and then we'll be able to leverage that community. And we use that term a lot without thinking about it a lot. But the reason I thought this would be a really good topic is partly, what you just said at the very end, the community of circumstance. Even that, when you think about it, the way you described it, like what's a circumstance that you might find yourself in, right? A
Mm-hmm.
refugee status, for example. Well, that's a community. You're all refugees together, all the Ukrainians who left the Ukraine for Poland. That's a circumstance they find themselves in, and they'll have that. What they do with it going forward, someday this war will be over. Someday, let's assume most of them go back home, if there's a home to go back to. I'm just sort of playing it forward, right? Will they still be members of that community? Will they still have affinity for that? Will they have reunions? World War II is a super distant memory for almost everyone, but they interviewed a guy yesterday. It was the 80th anniversary of a very famous raid. And he was the last guy, the last pilot alive from the squadron that had flown it. This old British guy, he's like 100 years old. And they asked him, what does it mean to you? And he mostly said, I remember the guys. I remember the group of fellows who've now, most of them have been dead for decades, right? But, that was a community to him that continued, even though they were no longer bombing, the Ruhr Valley with these big planes. They had experienced something together and that gave them an affinity. So I think I want people to focus on the idea that community is something that has something in common, a group of people
Mm-hmm.
who have something in common. Community in common actually come from the same root, and they know it and they feel it that way, right? It's not a community if you all shared something but you have no idea. And so I think it's a slippery concept. It's generally easier to define by what it isn't than what it is. It is definitely not things like an online FAQ. So if you build a website and you have people who can, experts who answer questions or something like that, it may become a community, but initially it's not because the members themselves aren't connected to each other. We just use it as a blanket term for any group that we want to start engaging with what we're doing. And it's like, oh, it's the community of people who take brand X. Well, if that's not salient to them, then no, it's not a community, right? It has to have meaning and it has to give you a sense of purpose and place, right? It's a starting point. And there are, to your point, there's all sorts of communities. Some of them are permanent, some of them are ephemeral, some of them are very casual. Some demand a commitment of your entire life. So think about, I lived in San Francisco for a long time. There was a Zen commune just north of San Francisco called Green Dragon Temple, the San Francisco Zen commune. And those people gave their lives to living in community, as they called it, to become better at being Zen practitioners. It was an interesting idea. Now that's a community that is total, like that's your whole life. But
Hmm.
we think of communities as being geolocated,
Hmm.
probably as a historical accident more than anything. It does matter where you live, but it mattered a lot more in a time before the kind of mobility that we have now, the kind of remote life many of us live.
Hmm.
I think churches disappearing, and there's no question that church attendance is down. That was a major community center, and those were geolocated. And so when you talk about like the St. Stephen's community, right? My local Catholic church. I'm not Catholic, but church 2 blocks away from me is Catholic. And that's a community. They know each other. They play baseball together. Their kids play baseball together. They do a lot together.
Yeah. But I
That,
mean, to that
yeah,
point, even church has become like virtual. I know like they used to be, everyone in this town is like you just mentioned, going to, one church and the activities and we're all sort of living similar lives. But now anyone could be joining a like an online church uh, Sunday
right. You
session
could be
from like,
anywhere.
from China. It's so I feel like the world has gotten a lot bigger and that kind of makes it harder to define like these smaller communities because
Well, I
like
think
we're
again,
dispersed.
this is where social sciences sometimes have, not sometimes, I think almost always have, not like we're more insightful about people, but we've just spent more time thinking about it, and we have vocabulary to kind of tease apart different elements of that. So
Right.
what we used to talk about in terms of networks, and these are networks of influence as well, by the way. So the reason they matter to us as marketers is if you have a community that is built around, say, a religious practice or a disease state, right? Like
Mhm.
the HIV community was a real community for a very long time, especially, the 90s, the early 2000s. The HIV advocacy community was a community. They knew each other. There were, not a hierarchy. It wasn't like people voted, but people knew who the important players were, and you had to talk to people if you wanted them to sort of then convey to the community that trusted them that yes, this is a source of people that we trust. So we
Mhm.
think about communities because we want people to support each other. We want people to engage each other. We talked about loneliness recently, like community is the antidote to loneliness.
Yeah.
But the nature of communities has changed. At least people haven't changed, but the ways that we can engage with each other have changed. And so,
Right. Well, so
you
to
know,
that point,
yeah.
when we think about, because you brought up, and I want to dive a little bit more into that. When we talk about types of community, let's say, a group of people who all have breast cancer or some sort of genetic disorder, rare disease. To me, that going back to like the definitions of community would be the circumstance. So, because of something that's happened to them, getting sick or whatever it may be, they're part of this community now. But like, is that fair to say that they're now all part of this community? What if they don't see it that way? Or what does that even mean? Like, is it just to say, oh, you
Well,
guys
if they
all have
don't,
this in common?
yeah, I would say that's a really good question, and maybe this is where my vocabulary fails me, right? Is the degree to which you allow something to define yourself. So, you're mentioning the types of communities that people don't actually want to be part of, right? For
Right.
example, a few years ago, I interviewed one of the guys who survived the Pulse nightclub massacre down in Florida. If you remember that, a man walked
Oh,
into
wow.
a
Yeah.
gay nightclub and started shooting. And, like many survivors of these things, it will mark him for the rest of his life. But he actually then turned it into a bigger sort of part of his life. And he goes around and he talks to people. And he said it was really a way of reclaiming my life because I was trying to white knuckle it through like lots of other people. And then when I started talking to them, and then we realized we were all going through the same thing, and that like I couldn't go to bed without checking the doors 5 times on the locks on the doors and stuff. And we all found that we were doing it. To me, that's the moment when the community, the post community formed. And that's when this tragedy, this horrible thing that happened became a source both of pain, right? He couldn't sleep, couldn't go. But then when he found that other people were going through it and they could support each other, it became a community of support, or it became a community, and that supported him. And then he went one step further and he said, unfortunately, in America, I'm not in a very exclusive club. There's loads of people who've been through this. And now there's actually groups of people I talk to who were survivors of other big shooting massacres, which is, I can't believe I just said that sentence in 2023 in America. That's the reality. But there are actually enough survivors of these mass shootings that they're in touch with each other. That's a community. They don't want to be in this community, or they certainly, if they could go back in time, they would pull themselves out of the situation that put them in the community. But it's the community that gives them the strength to survive through it. And I imagine that's not a unique situation.
Right. And so what I'm also hearing, is it fair to say that, we cannot tell people that they're part of a certain community, and I'm talking about like our role within healthcare marketing, that, you're part of this community because of some observable factor that we're seeing that might connect people. It's really on us to understand where they see themselves as part of a community, and that might not necessarily be the community of people who have breast cancer. It might be a community of people who have breast cancer and love to work out. Like, you know what I mean? Like, just to understand
Right.
it to a little bit of a deeper level, to then be able to impact, whether it be interventions or whatever it is, programs to connect people. We have to understand where they see themselves.
Right. And one of the things that defines community is common language, right?
Mm-hmm.
So CrossFit is a community.
Mm,
If you're a CrossFitter, you know what a Murph is, and you know what a WOD is, a workout of
mm-hmm.
the day, and stuff
Mm-hmm.
like that. And but even within that, I know there's different cultures of CrossFit gyms. I know this because people talk or used to talk endlessly about CrossFit. I am not a
I
CrossFitter.
was gonna ask, I'm
Um,
like, are you a secret CrossFit person? And I just didn't
Are
know.
there secret CrossFit people? Like the
No,
joke is there's no such
that's a
thing.
good point.
So they all talk, right? What's the difference between Fight Club and CrossFit? Like you don't talk about Fight Club. So but in all seriousness, I think a lot of people find CrossFit to be a community that they appreciate and they draw strength from. And that's
Mm-hmm.
that's that's the important part here for us, right? That communities, we can define them in various different ways. I want to go back to this idea that we actually have some vocabulary we can use to tease apart different communities. I want to do it quickly, but I do think it's important. So, for example, in sociology, we talk about the difference between dense networks and multiplex networks. A
Mm-hmm.
dense network is one where everybody knows everybody else, right? So I, as an adult, have a weird, diffuse set of friends. It's not so much a community because a lot of them don't know each other. But when I was in high school, every one of my friends knew every one of my friends. And if you'd drawn a diagram of who's connected to whom, you would see a big cluster of dots all connected to each other. That is a dense network. And when you get something like Belfast, circa 1985, at the height of the Troubles, the second time around, in Northern Ireland, you would do a study, and these were very small neighborhoods. And because it was dangerous to leave your neighborhood, and because they were so closely tied to each other in the churches that they went to, that every network in Belfast was kind of a very dense network, that everybody knew everybody else. It was also a multiplex network, which means they knew each other in many different contexts. So they didn't just grow up together in the same community. They went to school together. They went to the same church together. They played the same sports together. That's small town life in America too, right? My kids know all their friends. They play on the sports teams with them. If we went to church, they would be going to church with them.
Mm-hmm.
They know each other in many, many, many different contexts. When you have dense multiplex networks, you have that sort of traditional village sense of everyone knows everyone and everyone does everything together. We
Right.
don't have that very much anymore. To your point, We have a lot of communities that are made up of people who aren't geolocated next to each other or who don't know each other in any other way. And they certainly might not know each other's friends. That becomes a different kind of community. I think when you talk about online communities for healthcare, that's exactly what we're talking about. It's single interest. They do get to know each other and they support each other, but it doesn't have to be geolocated. They don't have to go bowling together, for example. Does that make sense?
Yeah, and they might, so yes, it's definitely not multiplex, but it might not even be dense. Like they might not even know one another in an online community, right? Like you talk to one person and maybe you connect, but it's not that everybody knows everybody. So it is sort of interesting and a
Well,
little like how do you
yes,
even,
and
what's the end?
sorry, I cut you off, but go ahead,
No.
make your point. But yes, and
Yeah, no,
so
I
what
was
we
just gonna say, like, how is that then different? How do we actually ensure we know that these people might just be connecting in like a single point of time, a single day, and then after that they don't maybe, what can we
so that's
do
a
to
group
make
of
that
people, right?
rich?
Right. So let's take the example. It's interesting you say that. So there is a size of community that is sort of natural default between like, I don't know, 50 and 100. Some people will say 70 and 120, but it's essentially the size of the smallest unit of any army. And it
Mm-hmm.
turns out that this is the size villages get to generally in, non-structured environments and stuff. It's about as big as a community can get where everybody can still know each other and
Mm-hmm.
function.
Mm,
And when you look at online communities with 10,000 people who are active, what you find is within those sub communities of about 50 to 100 people who talk to each other, it isn't a community of 10,000 people. It's a community of 10,000 people comprised of hundreds of little groups of 50 to
yeah.
100 people talking to each other. And they do get to know each other. And they do start asking each other about how'd your visit to the doctor go?
Yeah.
They do start anticipating each other's needs. So I think the difference between 10,000 random users bouncing off each other like atoms,
Yeah.
that's just a group of people who are signed up to the same thing. But if you go, hey Sanika, good to see you again. How was your doctor's appointment? How's,
Right.
your
Yeah.
child doing? Blah, blah, blah. Now you're part of a community and now you feel seen and heard and supported. And
Yeah.
and that's different. Does that make sense?
Yeah, yeah, that makes sense. Totally. All right. That's interesting. So I guess some trends that I'm sort of hearing. So not everything is a community and we can't create communities overnight, right?
Correct.
Okay. And then in a community, and what sort of then does make a community is something shared. So whether it be shared values, shared interests, shared situation that you're in, there has to be something shared. And it's a two-way street in that it's not just about having the commonality, but it's also about self-identification, right? Like there has to be an element of like, I
Yeah,
identify
you can
with this
refuse.
thing. Yeah,
Absolutely. I refuse to be put into the community of survivors of X,
right.
right? People will say that. I refuse to be defined by that. Fine, that's a totally valid choice. Then
Yep.
you are, however you're defined, you're not engaging or interacting, you're not embracing the mantle of, survivor of a mass shooting.
Hmm.
Totally get it, man. But
Yeah.
then you can't say that they're part of that community.
Right. And also, and I love to bring everything back to research because I think that's always our opportunity to really learn. And from like a research perspective, and we do primary research all the time, um, it's important for us to incorporate in topic guides, like to understand what communities people feel like they're a part of. And I know we had a quick discussion on this earlier, but like it's not just about, okay, well, where do you go to for support or who do you turn to for support? We have to ask the questions of like, that get to how do you see yourself? Where do you see like the connection between you and someone else? And to really then understand, okay, we're not putting this person in the bucket of your community. You belong to a community of people who have this condition, but rather understanding where they see it so we could best connect with them.
Yeah,
Not
and also
assuming.
right. And we have an opportunity to point out connectivity, right? So that you might actually have community common interests with this group that you didn't think you did.
Hmm.
So, you and I joke sometimes about like immigrant children and stuff like that. So not to make it too personal, but Snika's parents both immigrated from India.
Hmm.
So, being the second generation child, that's that many, 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 many Americans share. And you don't have to be a descendant of Indian parents to have this sort of culture clash of like you're going to school in one environment, you come home and they've got a different set of values. That could be any immigrant.
Yeah.
And so you're part of the second generation community. You share certain experiences with them and you can talk about what it's like to live in two worlds and to have parents who, come from a totally different environment in many ways. That's a community. Do you feel part of that community? I don't know. Could I introduce you to somebody who's also in this similar boat and go like you two might have something in common? I mean, you might resent it. It would be kind of clumsy to do that, but I could create a community that way. I could
Yeah,
say, hey, do you know
absolutely.
what? You guys are all sort of part of the group of people whose parents do things that embarrass you at the shopping market, right? I had a friend who was from Spain. He was like, I used to have to pretend that I was buying bones for my dog because my mom wanted to make a certain Spanish stew. And like, I would go in every week and they'd be like, more bones, huh? And I'd be like, yeah, we have a big dog. Like he was too
Yeah.
embarrassed to say they were eating them, right? So,
No, I think that's such a good point. And it goes back to the point that we were making earlier. I'm Indian. If someone tells me, like, oh, you're part of the Indian community, I'd probably say, no, I feel more a part of the children of immigrant community, right? Like, that's
right.
where I find more of a commonality to your point. And so it's about understanding not like, where people see themselves and what they connect to.
Well,
Because,
I mean, look, I saw a very funny video recently and it sort of called this out to me. And it was a whole bunch of different young men from different communities. I think one guy was from Haiti and one guy was from Africa and one guy was from an Arab country. And what they had in common was then they turned the video around and all their moms were standing there with their sandals in their hand, ready to beat them with their sandals. And they were all terrified of their moms, right? And I think
right,
there was an Indian mom there. And it was funny. And it was like basically we have nothing in common except for we're all really scared of our moms when they take off their sandals,
right,
because they're going to hit us with them. And
right.
I'm not part of that community, but I could have a good laugh at it. And they presented it as the community of guys who are scared of their moms. So,
Right.
you know, I
Definitely.
think I think it is hilarious. I think I want to be practical as well at the end here. I know we've talked a lot about different things. I think one big type of community that's very important for us is something called a community of practice. Now,
Mhm.
that is a concept that was developed by two sociologists, Jean Lave and Etienne Wenger. Not that anybody cares or is going to look it up, but in the 70s, they were very interested in finding educational models that didn't imply failure for some students. So if some people get A's, some people get F's, right? And
Mhm.
they were like, what's the point of an educational model if not everybody is expected to pass? So they wanted to find sort of educational groupings, methods, approaches that were, everyone succeeds, and apprenticeships are one, right? If you are an apprentice tailor, you'll become a tailor someday. It might take you longer than the other guy, but you'll get there.
Mhm.
They developed this concept of what's called a community of practice, which is a group of people who are engaged around a common activity who want to get better at it collectively and individually. And that is the definition of a profession, right? I joined law school. I start learning about law. Lawyers then set the bar for me. I passed the bar and I joined the community of lawyers, and now we're all trying to practice law, right? But while I was in law school, we were trying to learn about it together. We would do study groups together. That's a community. We're trying to get better at it collectively and individually. When you
Yeah.
look at how people act online around healthcare issues, it's an online healthcare community of practice, without question. It
Mhm.
is something where people are trying to become better at being a breast cancer patient or the spouse of an Alzheimer's patient or the parent of a child with psoriasis. You go on these groups to become better at what you're doing. Now, better can be I'm better able to manage it, or I'm better emotionally equipped to handle it. Or if it's the case of, children with ADHD or something like that, just some place to vent and everybody else can feel like, man, I'm in the same boat. I feel seen, I feel heard. Community is the antidote to loneliness. And I think that's why we decided to do this one so hot on the heels of the last episode that we talked about. Communities are not just these things of like people who happen to take the bus together. That's not a community unless they identify as a community, the commuting community in suburban New York.
Yeah.
You
Yeah.
can
I think
point it out to them, but if we could create the conditions under which people were learning how to better manage their own stuff and then we're able to also educate other people on how to do it, that's exactly what these communities are for.
Yeah. Yeah, I think that's a great point to end on. I think that the work that we do, in specifically within behavioral science, is to be able to understand humans and then connect to them to really be able to like then change behavior. And I think understanding the concept of community and what that really means, how people are a part of it, and what they seek to get out of it helps us better find better ways to connect with people.
Exactly.
So
And
I
I will just repeat, I believe the antidote to loneliness is community.
Yep, totally. Yeah. Okay, thanks, Brad. That was a lot of great insight on community. So, thank you.
Well, let's be
Thanks for the
careful when we
listeners.
use the words. All right,
I
take
know.
care.
Yeah. Bye,
Bye.
everyone.
Breaking the Code is a podcast by Havas Health and U's Medical Anthropology Department. Created and produced by Brad Davidson and Sanika Garcia. Content editing done by Catherine Rossi. Post-production audio editing done by Gabriel Allen Cummings. And inspiration by all of you. Thanks for listening and your continued support. If you enjoy these episodes, we would love to hear from you. Please leave a rating and subscribe. Until next time.